Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this masterclass. It's a program that's being coordinated by the Faculty of Law and the Faculty of Humanities, the Humanities and the Faculty of Law. It's a great honor. My name is Tembeka. I'm going to be the core program director this morning.
Morning. My name is Luandile Msimanga. I'm a co-program director at Dr. Mtinka. Thank you.
To kick things off, we must first welcome you, and welcoming shouldn't be a long speech. We only simply say in isiXhosa, khululani bhaji namkelekile. You may take off your jackets. You are very welcome. We obviously are honored today to have this program. We'll introduce later whom we have. You've noted Prof Ngcukaitobi. They're going to be with us shortly. But first of all, we'd like from the Department of History and Political Studies, Dr. Vusi Khumalo, who's recently launched his book, to do opening remarks. And we acknowledge, by the way, the leadership of the university that is here this morning. And can we give a round of applause to Dr. Vusi Khumalo as he comes.
Good morning, and good morning, everyone. And thank you very much, Dr. Mtinka, and you are all welcome. Well, I'm being asked by the Dean to actually introduce Advocate Ngcukaitobi, whom I happen to know from Johannesburg. We actually did a very complex case together, which shows how history connects with law. So nowadays, historians are working very close with legal experts on the issues of land, but not only on the issues of land, they also work very hard on issues of chiefdoms. So this is why I always tell my students that the history, it's no more that history. It's so diverse. You can work with lawyers, you can work with architects and so forth. In any case, the purpose of this lecture it's to inspire our students. That is why before I introduce the advocate, I just touch on these issues, because in most cases, students, they don't know what to do. They say, Doc, what are we going to do with history? Anyway, yeah, so basically, this is why I think Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi is so important. He's one of the few lawyers, if I may call him a lawyer. He's an advocate, but a lawyer is an advocate. He's one of the few lawyers that I know in this country who has actually done very amazing work. He has produced these two books that form part of my collection. This one, it's on Land is Ours, and here he tells us about the history of the problems of land, as well as the history of lawyers, black lawyers in particular, in South Africa, and he grapples with the challenges of colonialization and on how it actually impacted on black communities, ranging from the Cape up to Limpopo. And he also produced this one, the Land Matters. I think this is more of a book that connect me and him as a lawyer. He's an amazing scholar, I must say. He goes to the court, he argues legally, then he comes back. He takes out his legal gown and sits in his study as a historian. So he's a very amazing man because his work focuses on our history. And this one focuses on the problems that we are currently facing in South Africa. The problems of land, restitution. So here he grapples with the challenges that South Africa is currently facing on land reforms. I won't spend much, but it's very important for us and for you as students to see that history has changed over time. In the olden days, we were looked down upon, in high school in particular, we were looked down upon by the science students. Because in those black schools in the olden days, we had say four matric classes, and one will be a science class. And those science students were seen as elite and better than us. But now things have changed, because now those science students, they knock on our doors as historians and ask more about their past, because they only know, they think scientifically, they think technically. So in short, I'm glad that today at least we have an advocate who would show you on how history connects with law. Because I usually say to my students that history has got, everything has got history. So now we are working with lawyers, and he's the only, I must say, legal expert that I know who writes history, and he loves history. So I'm not going to be long. I think I've just covered, and I'm not going to be able to stay for a long time because I'm teaching at 11:45. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khumalo, for those introductory remarks. Just introducing us to the interdisciplinary study that Prof Ngcukaitobi does, the intersectionality between the law and the history, that he does so very well. Thank you so much. On to the business. Now mine is to introduce Advocate Ngcukaitobi SC. Then when I'm done introducing him, I hand over to him. Prof Tembeka Ngcukaitobi is an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Law's Department of Criminal and Procedural Law at Nelson Mandela University. He holds a BProc and LLB from the University of Transkei, now known as Walter Sisulu University, and 2 LLM degrees, one from Rhodes University and the other, one from Rhodes University and the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Ngcukaitobi is an advocate of the High Court of South Africa, a senior counsel and Judicial Service Commission member appointed by the President of South Africa. An author, Professor Advocate Ngcukaitobi has written 2 books titled The Land is Ours and The Land is Ours, South Africa's First Black Lawyers and the Birth of Constitutionalism, as well as Land Matters, South Africa's Failed Land Reform and the Road Ahead. Both books were selected by SAFM for their book segment section. Land Matters was shortlisted for the Sunday Times Book Prize of 2022. He specializes in public, land, labor, and competition law. Labor Court and Land Claims Court appointed. So he's been an acting judge in the South African High Court, Labor Court and Land Claims Court, and even the High Court, and appointed by the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development. Professor is also a part-time member of the Competition Tribunal, appointed by the Minister of Trade and Industry. He has published several academic articles in the Industrial Law Journal, South African Journal of Human Rights. Oh, this thing is failing me. Sorry for that. And Acta Juridica on the subjects of labor law and constitutional law and administrative law. With those words, colleagues, students, and everyone present, I would like to welcome Professor Ngcukaitobi. Can we clap our hands?
Thank you, Molweni. Ndiyabulela Gqirha Lwazi Mthimka, nawe Gqirha Lwazi Khumalo, nawe Mnumzana Umsimanga. Befanele nokwana siyamixwa apha kulesi stage sihleli kuso. Lesahlala nje singamadoda, bona bakusebuhlanti impela. Anyway, it is what it is. Mna ndi-visitor nje apha mandingathethi. Xa uyi-visitor ezindaweni ufuna ukuthula ukucoka. Wenze le nto imenyelweyo. Anyway, I obviously know Dr. Mthimka. We met up at Stratton, but I have enormous respect for his political analysis. I usually watch him with a bit of envy on television because I think what he does, he puts the science in political science. Because a lot of people, I watch them talk there and I wonder, where is the scientific part? So he is one of the few that gave us the scientific part. I also know Dr. Vusikumalo. We debated at length a complicated land claim. Most land claims ultimately turn on history, debated at length. A land claim which, I mean, ultimately got resolved for a few families and not for the community. The dispute in that case was whether the dispossessed were a few families or whether the dispossessed were a community. He was of the view that they were a community. That's the view I also wanted. And there were other historians who were of the view that the dispossession was of a few families and that the compensation or the restitution should only focus on those families. So we struck up a friendship since then. So I'm very pleased that both of them are here today. I've obviously met Dr. Nomalanga, Professor Nomalanga Mkhize. I'm a doctor, but I hear that she's a professor, which is something that fills me with a lot of pride for many, many, many years. And I see that Professor Andre Odendal is also here. I was actually talking outside with Professor Maseko about the pioneering work of Professor Odendal, Vukani Bantu. I don't know if any of you know that that book. It's truly pioneering in many respects. I sort of wished, I had been aware of it in the 10 years preceding to the publication of The Land is Ours. Definitely would have enriched my research. But I remember seeing him at the launch of The Land is Ours, invited by Judge Albie Sachs at the Constitutional Hill, and he came to me afterwards and he asked if I had been aware of Vukani Bantu. I sort of scratched my head in embarrassment. But I've subsequently read it, and there is actually much to commend in that pioneering study. I hadn't been aware that he had been at Stellenbosch. I would have teased him about that. But one of his former professors had read my book, The Land is Ours, and invited me to his house where I spent 2 days debating the manuscript of The Land is Ours, and him disagreeing vehemently with some of the conclusions I was reaching, but he was also unable to disagree with the historical foundations of the work. And then the only suggestion he could make was that I should submit it to Stellenbosch University for a PhD, which I resisted. I do many things, as you heard here, with the gentleman who was introducing me. One of the things I do is to try and understand what I call the colonial encounter. What happened when the British colonists arrived? In what ways did they change the lives of native people that they found? And in what way did the native people in turn change the way of the British people who arrived here? And this is a site, the Eastern Frontier is then the site of this conflict, between the British colonists and primarily the Xhosa. Of course, one can't discount the role of the Khoi, the role of the Zulu. People don't appreciate that, but the role of the Pond or the Tembu, but all of the subgroups and categories that fall under the broad rubric of the Xhosa. So I try and understand this encounter, the colonial encounter, and specifically to look at the shaping of the law, right? How did the colonists disrupt the modes of thinking about the law, right? And the modes of practicing the law of African people. And what did the Africans do about what they were learning from Europe, particularly from England? Some of that work is published in The Land Is Ours, specifically around how the first group of black lawyers began to internalize the ways of the whites, the ways of empire, the ways of Europe. And then to take the lessons they were learning from their encounter with the British, not for the goals of empire, but to confront the empire. One of the most significant moments is Cecil John Rhodes had this idea, of equality. Equality for all, this was his slogan, equality for all civilized men south of the Zambezi, right? Equality for all civilized men south of the Zambezi. And the question is, who is a civilized man? Who is a civilized man? And by which he meant, and these were not, this idea of civilization was not his invention, but it had been part and parcel of the sort of Cape colonial thought since probably the most significant agent of British imperialism. That's how I've described him in Land Matters. Sir George Grey, that's the name of this agent, and his idea was that the purpose of imperialism, the purpose of colonization, is to civilize the barbarian races. That was his idea. That's his agenda. I want to civilize the barbarian races. And by civilizing them, what he had in mind was that he wanted them to aspire towards the ways of the British. Right? Like today, guys, the four of us are speaking here with English. It's like that guy was here in 1856, 1857. He was causing chaos. But what he wanted by civilization was he wanted the native people to speak English. Right? That's the first thing. Language was so crucial as an instrument of civilization. So it's adopting a new culture, and the new culture always starts with language. So when you start dreaming in a particular language, start aspiring towards the ways of the West. So the first thing he thought was necessary was imposing a colonial language as a method of communication. So when we sit among ourselves as native people, we should speak in English, right? And so this method was achieved, through education, schools, right? And when you look at the first schools, primarily these were church schools, introduced by missionaries and funded by, the British government. The British government paid money for the funding. But they didn't have learners, they didn't have students, right? They still needed students. And the way to do this was to educate the children of the native chiefs, right? If you educated the children of the native chiefs, they could go back to the communities and they could continue to proselytize, right? They spread the word, of the gospel. Yeah. And in doing so, they not just spreading the word of the gospel, they're not spreading the idea that, Jesus died for our sins, but they are also spreading the idea that there is might in the empire. The empire is a very strong thing, but not just a strong thing, it is also a very good thing. It's a good thing for the native people to aspire towards the ways of the empire. So the school then became this site, right, of the externalization of the culture of the empire, right? Because if we were educated, we could also aspire towards the ways of the whites, and if we aspired towards the way of the whites, we could set a benchmark, right, a benchmark for civilization. So language was one of the most important ideas of Sir George Grey. The second, of course, was religion. It was to stamp out, traditional African beliefs and African religions. And you couldn't be both. You couldn't be, believing in African mythology or any of those, and at the same time believing in the fact that Christ died for our sins. So you had to replace your religious beliefs with new religious beliefs. And language was also crucial in that, because you had to learn to read and to write. Learning to read and to write was a big thing, to hold a pen. But what you were learning to read and to write was initially the Bible. So it was achieving a dual goal of civilizing you, because it was teaching you the ways of the West, but it was also teaching you the culture and the religion of the West. And then the third aspect of civilization, according to Gray, was public works. You had to learn to work, to work. Build the roads, build the clinics, build the schools, build the hospitals. How do you think this place was built? Do you think it was done by the whites? No, it was done by black people. So he introduced an extensive public works program, whether it was rail, whether it was roads, clinics, hospitals, police stations, prisons. So they were learning to do things, to build things up. And so that they needed the schools to support all of this, which is why a lot of native schools basically began as practical schools, agricultural schools. They did not have to learn to be intelligent or smart. They needed to learn how to use their hands. And of course, at a later stage, much of this was then contested, specifically under the influence of the Americans. So when Cecil John Rhodes speaks of this idea, equality for all civilized men south of the Zambezi, he is drawing from this example of Sir George Grey. But the problem is that there are now enough native people that have acquired civilization. There are enough that have accepted Christianity, that have acquired education, and they have also learned how to use their hands. And so this first group of educated Africans is asking the question, we have now achieved civilization, why are we not achieving equality, right? And that becomes this point of conflict. And that's the conflict I try to explore in The Land is Ours, is who were these educated groups of Africans, and in what ways did they try to use these concepts? In a sense, it's also a portrayal of the hypocrisy of the British, where they sort of promise you civilization, but you can never really achieve civilization because their intention is still to pillage and to plunder. So that's the first group that I tried to look into, and I found later on that it's also the group, maybe not the same individuals, but it's the same class of individuals that Professor Adre Ondendal tries to explore in Vukanibantu. In my case, it's specifically unique to lawyers. Try to look at the lawyers, and specifically try to inquire into this new generation of lawyers, or this first generation of lawyers. What did they want to do with the teachings and the lessons of the British legal system? And I find that one of the first things they saw was precisely this hypocritical treatment, that when there were students in England, they were truly, quote unquote, equal. They could use the same trains, they could attend the same universities at Oxford University, they could eat the same dinners at Lincoln's Inn, where they started to become lawyers. And they could write the same exams. But when they arrived back home, what they realized is that what the British practice in London is not the same as what they practice in the colonies. And so they begin this new struggle for equality, and develop these concepts of the rule of law, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution. And these are concepts they develop in a climate at which, if you stood at Church Square in Pretoria and you shouted equality in 1910, you would most likely be lynched, literally slit your throat, right? Because in many respects, equality claims were political claims. Right? Equality claims were political claims. So it was to make a political statement to say there should be equality before the law. That's to make a political statement. It also to make a political statement to say everyone shall have the right of, I think it was called universal franchise. Everyone can choose a government. They can choose who the prime minister would be. So they started as political claims. So what you then find is that this generation of lawyers is translating, right? It's translating political demands of African people. It's translating those political demands into legal demands. So it's making these statements of law, but these are political demands and they're translated. But they know that this is possible because they've learned about this in England. And they also have learned about this hypocrisy, that a government can do one thing in Europe and then practice something different in the colonies, right? And that's the first group. And the real significance of that moment, in 1923, there's a Bill of Rights published by Africans. It's a Bill of Rights published by Africans. One of the writers of that Bill of Rights is Pixley Ka Isaka Sembe. Writes the very first Bill of Rights. Pixley Ka Isaka Sembe writes the Bill of Rights. It's the most remarkable thing. The most remarkable thing. What runs through this Bill of Rights? What runs through this Bill of Rights is this idea of Cecil John Rhodes, equality for all civilized men south of the Zambezi. There's this inherent tension, right, in this idea that Cecil John Rhodes, being the sort of arch-imperialist, a very notorious arch-imperialist, but he is now being exposed. I mean, of course, he had been dead for 25 years at that stage. I think Rhodes died in 1898. But he had been dead for 25 years when this first Bill of Rights is introduced. And his memory is evoked. His memory is evoked. But as a critique, not to embrace, but as a critique, to illustrate the point that here is a man who promised us equality. He's now long dead. But we want this equality now because he set the preconditions. We've achieved the preconditions, you see. And then you find a retreat by the nascent South African state. People like Smarts and them and Herzog, are no longer willing to carry through this promise of Cecil John Rhodes. But the British themselves, who were responsible for creating the conditions under which the Afrikaners could dominate native people, black people. The British were responsible for creating those conditions because they aided and abetted the Boers. When I use Boers, that was the term used at the time, so please don't feel insulted. But they were responsible for aiding and abetting the Boers to create the conditions that would enable them to be a dominant political force. And we see this in the so-called Anglo-Boer War, 1899-1902. And we see it in the Treaty of Vereeniging that's prepared at the end of that war. And the main issue in the Treaty of Vereeniging is how are we now going to divide up political power between the British and the Afrikaners or the Boers, and what will the native question look like? What are we going to do with native people? We've now won the politics of it. What are we going to do with native people? So that's the basis of the Treaty of Vereeniging. The native question is never resolved, by the way, it's just postponed. But most of this, as you can see, war is over. The black people have been defeated in war. The last war is 1878. That's it. It's Ngcukaitobi's wars. That's the end of the war. What is now going to regulate this territory is law. But it's the law designed by the victors. They are going to set up the parameters, and those parameters will dictate primarily two questions: the political question of citizenship, right, and the socio-economic question of access to the land. So firstly, native people will be excluded from citizenship. You see this in 1910, right, when they draft the very first South African Constitution of the Union, 1909, 1910. Rights of citizenship. Who is in fact a citizen of the Union? Citizen of the Union is a person of European descent, whether it is Dutch descent. At that point, the concept of Dutch is amorphosized, because it's inclusive of the French, the Germans, and a group of people that had called themselves Afrikaners. And British descendants. Those are the two categories that acquire citizenship. They also acquire political rights. They can participate in the activities of the union. They can vote, they can be voted for, etc. Native people cannot, so they are not citizens. Native people cannot. And you see it in language as well. Which languages are recognized? Only Dutch and English are recognized. Right? Dutch and English are recognized. Dutch subsequently yielded to Afrikaans, I think, in 1921, but at the point at which the union was established, Dutch was the language, Dutch and English, both of which signify this idea that the native would be, I think the term that is used by Sol Plaatje, rendered a pariah in the land of his birth. Sol Plaatje's book, published in 1916, Native Life in South Africa. So once your language is excluded and your political participation is excluded in the formation of the union. So I think it's in Land Matters where I use this term that the distinctive birthmark of the new South Africa, right, is race, because they also have to form race. Race didn't always exist. These guys just created race from thin air, literally from thin air. So if you read the archives in Keynes in England, or you can just go to the parliamentary archives, actually. You don't have to go to Keynes. Go to the parliamentary archives of the 19th century or 18th century. You'd be surprised when the English politicians refer to the poor races of England. So which There's an overlap between race and class. They didn't think that a black person is a different race. They just thought a poor person is a different race. So when they come here, they create race. Say, okay, no, these guys are black, we are white. So it's totally manufactured, total thumbsuck. But it gains force as soon as it's translated into law, right? Once you translate anything into law, it then gains force because it can be enforced, but it also gains social acceptability. And you see this in 1913, right? In 1913, in Parliament, they're debating the Native Land Act. You can go to you can do this yourselves. You can go to Pretoria and look at the archives when the Native Land Act was being debated. And one of the opposition politicians stands up because the Native Land Act, you know what it's about? It's about dividing the land between the natives and the Europeans. Right? So which means that you need to first know who's a native and who's a European before you know how the land can be divided. Where, who's going to get the 7%, who's going to get the 93%. Europeans will get the 93%. And one of the opposition MPs stands up, he says, but who is a native? How do we actually know who's a native? And you know what the answer is? The answer is, well, the lawyers have already decided who's a native. Right? The lawyers have decided who's a native. Right? And we can just use the term that the judges have decided. Right? And when you look back at which judgment they're talking about, there's a 1906 judgment that's grappling with this question of who is a native. And it's also for purposes of dividing the land. So who is a native? Who is this native? And the native is anyone who does not have any European roots or origins. Right? But then they have a problem later on because the Asians also come and say, okay, we also have no European roots or origins. And then they have to define an Asiatic by excluding them from this rubric of Europeans. So the birthmark is both legal and political, right, of these countries. That the law is always helpful to defining the political system, and the politics are always defining the law. But it's white men that are deciding all of these concepts, right? The white men are just deciding who is excluded, who is included, right? And they all form part of the same social and political class. So the 1923 Bill of Rights is then a pivotal moment, right? Because it's a moment of disruption. But it's not the same disruption, for instance, that Maqoma was engaged in 100 years earlier. But it's a disruption within the realm, right, of this sort of European thought of modernity, because these are now the concepts that the Europeans have imposed, and Africans are engaging with these concepts, right? What do they mean for us? Now that war is over, what does law mean for us? So it's a pivotal moment because it uses these concepts in order to think about a new society. What would this new society look like? And they say, well, the new society must be founded on the Bill of Rights. But this Bill of Rights, it is unlike the pillage and the plunder of the British, right? It's in fact, it's very contradiction. But we don't say, that's what Africans say, we don't say the Europeans must go back to the sea, right? We say that they must find accommodation, but on terms decided by African people, right? But that conception, which you find in the 1923 Bill of Rights, I mean, I criticize it because towards the end of that Bill of Rights, there's this idea that speaks of the British as having been the greatest nation on earth because the British government is founded on the idea of justice. So I question that it's impossible that Pixley Isaac Aseme had forgotten the horrors of the British colonization to the extent that he could concede to them this idea of establishing a society based on justice. Again, you see there's another idea called justice, this idea called justice. And again, these are ideas that the British brought, because the British always pretended that their own society was based on liberty, equality, and justice. But when they came to the colonies, they did the opposite. But this is not obviously accepted. The British have a new friend in the Boers or in the Afrikaners. And what is important is race. They've now constructed this idea of race. That struggle never ends. It reoccurs in 1941. And when you look at what 1941 is significant for, is that it's the second year of the, well, maybe third year, of the Second World War, right? And the debate that is happening at that point is when the war ends, and that war, as most of you would know, it's on the one hand, it's the Allied forces led by Churchill and Roosevelt, Americans and the British, against Nazi Germany, Hitler, right? And okay, there was Mussolini in support, but he was just a little dog. But ultimately, Hitler was the man, right? So the question that is being debated on the Allied side is between Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. What will the universe look like after the First World War? What will the universe look like? I mean, after the Second World War, what are the principles that will govern the world once we have defeated Hitler, right? Now, the principle that is fundamental, that is then decided, it is self-determination. All nations must have a right to self-determination. Everyone must have a right to self-determination, right? But here is the problem, and again, this is where I come back to this history of intellectual thought by black lawyers in this country, right? There is a problem with the principle of self-determination. Problem with the principle of self-determination. The Africans have no right to self-determination because in 1940, 1941, 1942, 1943, the entire African continent, I mean, people say Ethiopia was not, but I mean, it's clearly under Italian control. The entire African continent is under European control of some sort, right? Whether as colonies or as spheres of influence, but it's under European control. So the question is, how do you then apply this principle? How do you apply the principle of self-determination to Africa? It's black lawyers who think about this, right? The president of the ANC at the time is Dr. Kuma. He's a medical doctor, not a lawyer. He's a medical doctor. But he sets together a committee, right? People like him, Tim Kulu. Seme was back again. People like him, Tim Kulu, are sitting in this. He's an attorney from Engcobo. Actually studied at the Cape College, which is now UCT. Like when you go there and look, I'm looking from Tim Kulu's archives. These archives don't exist, but you can see some, anyway. Yeah. So there's a committee of 4. They sit together and they try and figure out what are the principles that should relate to Africans after the First World War. And the main issue that they are debating is how do we translate these principles, right, into a usable document for Africans, right? And they come up with something called the Africans' Claims. And that Africans' Claims then has a Bill of Rights. But this Bill of Rights is different to the 1923 Bill of Rights because in its character, it's universal. It will apply everywhere. But they question Jan Smuts. White people love Jan Smuts. Okay, well, black people also, but white people more. Jan Smuts is universally revered. He's universally revered. If you go to Westminster in England right now, there's a big statue of Jan Smuts next to Nelson Mandela and Winston Churchill. You can't believe it. Jan Smuts next to Mandela. Churchill, okay, Churchill and Jan Smuts, they can be in a statue together, no one. But to put them next to Nelson Mandela, but Jan Smuts is pursuing this idea, right? He is going to Europe because there's now going to be this conference of the Allied forces to think about these principles that will regulate the world after the defeat of the Nazis. But at home, the black lawyers are calling Smuts out. What they are saying to him is that it's hypocritical of you, sir, to go to Europe and to champion these principles that are based on the universalization of human rights, when in South Africa, your own country of birth, black people are under the domination of the whites. So unless you guarantee them freedom, you have no right and no moral standing to go to Europe and to champion the freedom of the Europeans, right? And this word goes out also not just to Jan Smuts. Okay, Jan Smuts' responses is that I'm not going to listen to you asking for ideas that are wholly impractical. That is his response, that this is a wholly impractical idea. I will not be listening to you. But the idea itself stays. It goes through to Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill. What is Winston Churchill's response to the claim by Africans that you cannot apply the principles of universal human rights and you cannot apply the principle of self-determination unless Africans are free, right? Churchill turns around and he says, no. These principles are principles to be applied to territories liberated from Nazi rule, right? From the German occupied territory, whether it's Poland or France or any of those areas. These are principles that would be applicable, and they will not be applicable to Africans. Nor will they be applicable to Asians. Right? Remember, at that point, even India, massive territory, was still under British occupation. Right? So there is again an exposure, although, to be fair to the Americans, Roosevelt actually thought that these principles must be applied across the world without regard to race. And Churchill resisted it and insisted that they would only be applicable to the freed territory that were occupied by the Nazis. But the point for us is that the universality of rights is a fundamentally African concept. It comes from here, right? And the applicability of this concept of self-determination, every nation shall have the right to self-determination, to Africans is also a South African concept. You know what happens, 1945? Universal Declaration of the Bill of Rights. You know what? It's its fundamental principle. It's the principle of the universalization of human rights. 1948, the principle of the universalization of the right to self-determination. Their roots are here. So, and this is the thing. It's all in this part of is in the land is ours, right? This becomes universal principles, but hotly contested, never applied in South Africa. 1948, of course, is a dangerous year in this country because D.F. Malan wins an election under the slogan of apartheid. So although the world is going the direction of universalizing human rights, South Africa is going the opposite direction, of establishing jingoism, of establishing racial oligarchies and formalizing apartheid. But the question is, who are the, and when you look at the rights themselves that are listed it's now produced ultimately. The draft began in 41, but it was ultimately produced in 1943. Look at that document. Look at what is contained there, the list of rights that are contained there, right? Freedom of the press, right? Freedom of equality, the right not to be imprisoned arbitrarily, etc. Most of those rights then survive throughout to the foundation of our Constitution. There is a moment, an interlude in 1955 when the Freedom Charter is passed. But those foundational individual liberties, right, not only influence the world, they also influence today's modern constitution. So the point I was making at the beginning is to show how this foundation of the constitutional system, right, was in fact a response, a political response translated into law by the first generation of African lawyers and African intellectuals as a whole, right? And those claims, of course, have now been taken away from us. When I published The Land is Ours, there was a rather popular narrative. I don't know if it was popular, but it was certainly a narrative that existed of our constitution as being a Eurocentric document, and white people being praised for giving us this document, right? And missing out its very essence, that its origins are South African, right? The actual individuals who conceived these ideas were South African lawyers. They were obviously not trying to recreate the world as it was in 1652 when Jan van Riebeeck arrived. They were trying to envisage a new world order. In other words, how do we construct a new reality, not on the basis that the Europeans did not arrive, but on the basis that the Europeans did arrive, which was the historical fact. And so how do we then create a new reality which would fit into the global order, right? And what they had in mind was probably the most sustainable or sustained idea, which is what you want. You want a society that's based on universal Bill of Rights. You want to create a society that's based on freedom. You want to universalize these concepts of the Bill of Rights, right? So when we talk about history and law, etc., I'm always intrigued when they talk about the history of South African law and they go to Justinian, right? Go to Justinian. It's always intriguing to me because if you are interested in the foundations of South African constitutional law, those foundations are not European foundations. They are South African foundations. They are South African. They are born of struggle. They're born of struggle for freedom, right? When the legal system was created, it's created as a response to the colonial encounter. It's a response to the colonial encounter, right? And its true champions are African men and African women. One of the ones I have not spoken about, but I've cited extensively, is Charlotte Maxeke, right? Yes, she is not a lawyer, but her input, right, on issues of land shines through the 1943 Bill of Rights, right? She is, in fact, praised, and there is a booklet published about her by the founder of the 1943 Bill of Rights, Africans Claims, Uma, right? Now again, those historical foundations are erased and forgotten, right? So I challenge law faculties to move beyond the distortion. I went through university at a time of great distortion, where I believed that Africans had no contribution to make in the modern conception of the Bill of Rights. And the ways Africans were understood is through the narrow prism of customary law. You know, if you want to know African indigenous law, go to the customary law class. Outside of the customary law class, we had no input. We had no input to make in property, no input to make in contract, no input to make in delict, no input to make in, they call it torts, or whether it's defamation, etc. Yet, the foundations of the legal system, how do you deal with property in a colonial system, right? How do you deal with property in a colonial system when you are trying to create conditions that would contradict the imposition of the colonial modes of understanding property. So how do you deal with that? When the first people to think meaningfully about how to confront the law of property were African people. How do you deal with land dispossession? The first person to think meaningfully about that is an African person. His name is Msimang. Right? And the paper is there, it's quoted in full. Right? And when you look at English students today, dealing with cases of defamation, one of the cases they learn is Mangena versus the Sunday Times. And who is Mangena? It was Alfred Mangena, the very first South African attorney, right? Because he had brought a claim in England against a fellow called Mdolomba, who was a member of the Methodist Church. Ngumwisile kane negqirha lwazi Tembeka. So babini singaba ngwisile. Kwakukade kusiliwa ke pha ewisile. But the point is that if you look at the case called Mangena versus the Times, it's a preeminent case that is used today, not 1920, today, in the law of torts in England. But South African scholarship, South African law faculties are not interested in teaching about the case and in teaching about the personality behind the case. Why was Alfred Mangena in England? What was he doing? Who was he? Who was Mdolomba? What were they doing, right? The same as conceptions of property, right? Miller versus Sobuza, a case that was litigated by Pixlika Izagasem, all the way to the Privy Council, which established the principle that Africans do not have a conception of ownership of property. Right? Africans do not have a conception of ownership of property insofar as land is concerned, because their ownership model is communal and not individual. And the distortion in the judgment is that because it's communal, not individual, therefore it means that there's no ownership. That concept lives through this idea that Africans do not have a conception of ownership of land. It lives through, right? And you look at the older cases, Sobuza versus Miller. Who was litigating it? Pixlika Izagasem. But if you read the arguments that were made by Pixley, which were rejected by the Privy Council, read the arguments that Pixlika Izagasem made, right? Those arguments confront and reject as fallacious this idea that Africans do not have ownership over the land, and dispute the fact that simply because it's communal rather than individual, it means there is no ownership at all, right? Now, again, no one has heard about this case of Sobuza versus, of Miller versus Sobuza. No one has heard, well, people might have heard about Seme, but they don't understand Seme as the legal thinker. It's the person who actually conceptualized an argument, right, and presented it in court. It may have lost, but he conceptualized it, presented it, and he tried to dispute the idea that Africans have got no modes of thinking about property that are distinct to the modes of thinking about property of the Europeans. So today you find South African cases that project this notion of the common law. If you've ever heard about this thing called the common law, yeah, it will terrorize you. Right? Because it's not common. Right? It's European. Right? It's not common, it's European. And it has been made common by the sheer political force of conquest. The sheer political force of conquest. But there was always a contest to it. There was always a contest. It was not always universally accepted. It was contested even at the time the Europeans tried to impose it. But those contrary voices, right, those contrary voices are absent, maybe not absent, but silenced by the scholarship, right, silenced by the faculty, silenced by this universal adherence to European ways of thinking. So yes, I don't argue for an abolition, but I argue for interruption at certain points, and that these alternative voices have always existed. And they have always tried to show us that there is an alternative future, not an alternative past, but an alternative future. And that alternative future is based on accommodation. Let me make this clear. The Europeans were never interested in creating equality in Africa. They were only interested in pillaging and plundering. Never interested in creating. It's impossible that they could have been the brains behind the establishment of a constitutional system. Impossible. It was never in their political interest. The only group of intellectuals, of thinkers that was ever interested in creating equity, equality, shared visions were Africans. It was always in their interest to do so. So it is strange that in history there has been an erasure, a deliberate erasure, and a deliberate suppression of these alternative voices. Today we have the tools to rediscover. This is difficult work. This is hard work. But we have the tools today to rediscover, these alternative voices, these alternative forces, right? These alternative intellectual movements. We have the tools to rediscover them. And to put them back where they belong in history, to put them back where they belong, at the moment of foundation, right? But our faculties are not doing that work. What they have done is to superimpose a common law system on a constitutional system, and then acted as if these two are seamless, whereas the one was intended to contradict the other. The constitutional system was always intended to contradict the common law system and to create a new world order. That was always the purpose behind it. Now, this is why we are still producing students that repeat, regurgitate the common law ways. And that is why the constitutional model is unable to meet its objectives, because we are presenting and creating photocopies of the European modes of thought, and not people that will challenge the ways of thinking of the West. Not using Makoma's ways, although I love Makoma, but using constitutional ways, because the purpose behind the constitutional order was to always confront an unfair system of thought. Now, that is what I've been trying to do, is trying to put back the dignity in African thought, not by creating a fossilized version of custom, but by creating a modern version of custom, a lived reality of custom, which is not answering the 1652 problem, but answering, of course, you have to draw from those concepts, but answering a problem of 2023 and reclaiming the origins. All right, so I was told that I should, at some point, stop speaking. I think that moment has arrived. Thank you.
First thing I have to do is this one. Another round of applause, please, for Prof Ngcukaitobi. Wow. There's a saying, silent waters run deep. As Prof was speaking, and I'm listening to his art of presenting, it's so great to see it live today. I think in the media platforms, they turn up the volume, but it was so lovely to hear the depth of silent waters, if you know what I mean. You know, he's making strong, really groundbreaking speech, but not in fiery political speech, but in silence. And I think that it sinks that way. Wow, thank you. I think I had to comment about the art of it first. You touch on a number of things, Prof, which relate to what we are trying to do at university. Maybe before you guys get a panic that I might take too much of a bite on this, let me give you a picture of what's coming. Prof, you were supposed to come back after a Q&A session to talk about selected cases. It seems to me that you've combined your presentation with selected cases and your first bit. Okay, you're nodding. So what we will do then, after we're going to have a Q&A session, but I really want to, and I would be failing the boss of my boss if I don't do this, just to reflect on how what you've spoken about is in line with our strategy as a faculty of humanities, and Ulwandile will talk about how that relates to what they're doing within the Faculty of Law as program directors. Then you will be pleased to know, Prof, that we're changing Ubhlandi for Itlama after this. So after that Q&A, Ulwandile, my colleague, will facilitate reflections, which will mostly be from Etlabeni than Ebhlandi. And it's mainly from, there'll be reflections after the Q&A, which come mainly from our female scholars, emerging scholars. So before we get the Q&A, please think about your questions now. We're not going to take much because we're running out of time, but we really would like to give you some time. But I want to touch on a few things, Prof. Wow. The idea that you advance first, that the attempt that these lawyers were making was not imagining a world before 1652 or in 16, they're not answering, in your own words, responding to a 1652 question, but were futuristic and are shaping the thinking and practice going forward from where they were. And indeed, I'm happy that you trace the development of constitutionalism, and I don't think you are starting, by the way, I've got the 2 books for you to sign after this, but you are redeeming them in the history of the discipline of law in South Africa, and in fact showing how their intellectual work influenced ideas in the world, as well as the ultimate constitutionalism that we would have. So if there are any politics students here, you would realize that what Prof was talking about, drawing on the experiences or the approach that was used by these lawyers in order to first write about, how unjust the South African system was comparative politics. Comparative politics, because he, in his own words, says these lawyers experienced how life and things were done in Europe and compared it with how the very same, group of people were attempting to govern in South Africa, and saw the contradictions. And that's the principle of comparative politics, that we compare political systems with a view to learning and crafting ways of doing things which are incrementally better as we learn. You also make a very interesting point, Prof, about how within the law faculty, and I think we're guilty of it too, in the entire academy, of training people who regurgitate things, and the word that came to my mind as soon as you mentioned that was dehumanization. Dehumanization. Dehumanization is this thing of taking a human being who've got creative potential and limiting that, the expression of that, such that what you have is nothing more glorious than an animal. You know what I mean? Because humans interact with life and reality, and the creative spark in them allows them to shape things in their own ways and in the ways that only they can. But any attempt to dehumanize seeks to target that very same creative potential of a human being, such that you have a human being who's reduced to be a machine. You plug in this part of the value chain, production value chain, and all that you do is that part. Don't think critically about it. And within humanities, by the way, this is how we have seen as a defense in a world that is technologically focused and all of that, where AI is threatening to replace humans, where the idea of training a critically thinking subject is foremost. Then lastly, I want to talk about how, I think you've dribbled us, Prof. And how you've dribbled us is in a very beautiful way. Because when I saw what we were attempting to do in indigenous knowledges and the line that we were coming with, we're expecting somebody who's going to mine pre-colonial ways of thinking and this, that, and the other, and recenter that. But you've done epistemic disobedience, where you're saying, in fact, what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you how the Africanness of the mainstream, if you like. And I thought, for me, that was wonderful. And I like how you are, and I've seen you do this, by the way, and for me it was good today to actually see it as part of a broader repertoire of yours that says, my defense of either constitutionalism comes from acknowledging that the fathers and mothers, to the extent that you acknowledge also the female scholars of back in the day, are at the center of thinking about what we have, to such an extent that to find indigenous knowledge or influence, I don't have to leave the mainstream and go and unearth something else. So that's really encouraging that you've approached it that way. I don't want to hog the platform. We're going to go now to the floor, but that was really heartwarming for me, that the pathways to decolonizing are as much about the essence of who people are and finding things that they do outside of the mainstream, as it is about simply recognizing how even the mainstream in many ways is influenced by different cultures. How many people have said, for example, is it Dr. Christian Barnard who performed the first heart transplant or surgery, whatever the thing is? The last few years I've been focusing on my studies and didn't study everything else. So pardon me if I forget. Anyway, they argue that he had his own black assistant who had been with him, please correct me if I'm wrong, who had been with him and had contributed significantly to the process. Except that in the history books, that black name has got, that black face and skill has no name. And Christian Barnard does. So there are many other instances where, you know, we can find examples of these. I think I once saw a story about an African American in the aviation space, a pioneering person as well in the aviation space, whose name gets redacted. So lastly, as I go to the Q&A, we're busy with our strategy reflection process in the Department of History and Political Studies. One of the things that Prof Ngcukaitobi recently was saying was that we have failed dismally in South Africa to produce a distinctly post-apartheid scholarship unlike our West African counterparts, who, whether it was in literature, in the medical sciences or history, there was just a mushrooming of that kind of scholarship as soon as independence came. So we are grappling with this, and the archive, it's important to mention, as a faculty, the archives and redeeming the archives has become a center. Because you correctly pointed out, it's difficult to do this work that you are challenging us to do, to rewrite the history. But we have started with the work. I think the Dean and Dr. Khumalo have done, and Prof Ngcukaitobi have recently helped this city with organizing its own archives. And there's processes to now expand that work to have a lot more contribution. Anyway, are there any hands if you want to contribute to this discussion? I note you, Prof Ngcukaitobi, I note you, sir. And then two people in front. Any more? Oh, you and you, ma'am, and you, sir. Okay, at the back. All right, well, let's start with Prof Ngcukaitobi, and then please pardon me, while I was still studying, I didn't pay attention to the leadership, and everybody was playing what roles, and I forget people's names, and I'm embarrassed about it. Mhlekazi with a blue shirt. Yeah, Prof, please proceed.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Professor Advocate. I just wanted to ask one question, maybe provocatively, because I mostly lean to the argument you make, but then there's a part of me, mina ngiphuma emakhaya, samaqaba emakhaya. Asifundile thina, sifunde nje ngokuthi sekuyafundwa. But now my question is, lo mthetho lo ukukhuluma ngawo, kona umthetho wamazemtiti lo, lento ebuzwa nguMadlingozi ukuba ewe, yeah, of course, these blacks were fighting, but ngamazemtiti lawo. Today we call them Model Cs, we've called them coconuts, we've called them all these other things, but it's these ones, oh, excuse me, abacinga babhetere kunabanye abantu abamnyama. So xa bona bethi balwela umthetho apha, balwela bona. And I can see the thread of psychology, of amazemtiti, all through our history. One of the things that makes this university different in many ways is because it's largely a working class university, amazemtiti really don't dominate us here. As a result, we're able to actually think like Africans. But the moment you step into UCT, even when they call themselves black, they're Model Cs is. So I just want to know, they're not amazemtiti.
Thank you. Sir.
Okay, it's on. Thank you, Advocate, Senior Counsel. My name is Mahlubandile Ndondela from the Law Faculty, lecturer there. I found very much interest in your topic today, in your presentation today, because I was doing a research on legal history on another thing, and I ended up with a paper that is under review on the misdiagnosis in the courtrooms. I've submitted it to Law Journal for Legal History. But the point I'm going to is that what I was looking at there is when the South African courts took the English law systems of presentation of evidence at court, tried to apply it in South Africa. It did not work because the circumstances were different. And then later on, only around the 1950s, realized that no, we need to come up with our own system because the English law systems are not assisting us, particularly on the competence of witnesses. But whilst I was busy with that, I came across another contentious issue of language in the courtrooms, where you find that which, for example, I've worked in the rural areas, in the courtrooms, where you find that everyone is Xhosa, but we use English. And then when I go on appeal, I argue on the issue of interpretation. That is now, the interpreter said this or this was incorrectly recorded in the system, for whatever reason, but because we're using an English language. Now, my question with that background in mind, when I looked at the courts, some courts were saying, well, it's fine, we're going to accept it, that you can use the indigenous language in the courtroom. Another one I read was saying that, listen, there's a judgment in KZN which said this, in that the appeal judges and the review judges would not understand the language that is used there. So for them, let's use English then. It's recommended that we use English. So what do you think then would be the ideal for the court's role in reshaping our country, particularly the use of indigenous languages in the courtrooms? Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Ma'am, right here in front. Was it? No. Oh, it was him first, or her first. Cecil with a bandana. I'd like us to shoot straight to the question or comment.
Molweni, Gawulam Ubenati, and I'm a second-year politics student, and I come
We
from.
didn't hear your name, Gakle.
Oh, okay, my name is Ubenati.
Ubenati.
Chochisa. I come from a royal family. I'm affiliated to Ngcukaitobi. So my question is, coming from the legacy of apartheid and post-apartheid, and with the redress policies coming into play post-apartheid, post-democracy, where do we stand as traditional leaders in the current times? Where do they stand?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I could have kahlelat if I knew in advance. Let's come. Yes, please.
I'm not sure if I should stand or am I just sit?
As you wish.
Okay. No, thank you very much. My name is Ponso Tlongwane. Of course, my question is that I think perhaps maybe I would like to thank you for acknowledging the fact that you mentioned that the Constitution is unable to, of course, achieve its objective. And I think that is a conversation that is going on across the country, that our Constitution is unable to actually, address the injustices of the past. But I think that is what you say, is that the intention or the Constitution was intended to, contradict the common law, which it makes our people to be unable to actually get justice, So my question is, what measures can we put in order for us to be able to assist or actually aid the Constitution in order to be able to achieve its intended objective? Thank you.
Thank you. Sir. And then, was it you? That's the last person. Okay. I have to mind, so I'll take those last two. Please forgive me if I'm cutting somebody out. We've got to make time also for the people who are going to reflect after this Q&A. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Excuse me. My name is Alfonso Goliath, and I must say, very interesting presentation, and the way it was articulated by Advocate Senior Counsel Ngcukaitobi. Recently I'm also embarked on, I'm a law lecturer here at the university, criminal procedural law, previous magistrate in court, and I must say that I'm very impressed today. The reason why I came is because I'm also writing an article with regard to a judgment that you pronounced, Koko versus S. Although there was a misconception concerning your interpretation of the law, I completely agreed with your interpretation, but it was an issue for most with regard to our present law on sexual offenses, the whole issue of consent, just as a background. But my question is, I'm also embarking on my doctorate, I'm a doctoral candidate, and I'm writing on our minimum sentencing legislation. And the background of that legislation is so interesting because what you have said here, the way you reflected the history is very clear why South Africa is still embattled with a very high crime rate. And one of the reasons why we have a high crime rate is because of our sentencing laws. Our politicians want to create the impression that the issue of a crime must be resolved through the courts. In fact, that is not true. And yet, my agreement with you this morning is the fact that you correctly pointed out that our common law is not a prelude to the Constitution, but the Constitution is in fact a rectification of our common law. And that we see in our embattled judiciary. When we came into a constitutional democracy, South Africa experienced an attack from the judiciary, especially the predominant white component of the judiciary of the past, struggled to adapt the interpretation of our law, especially in particular our sentencing laws, where we still imposed sentences such as 2,416 years on prisoners, and if not all, was black accused. So I want to say, agree totally, it's not a question but a statement, agree totally that our Constitution is there to fight the injustices of our common law. And the common law is not necessarily introduction to our Constitution. Thank you, Advocate Senior Counsel.
Thank you, sir. Last person. So sorry if I cut anyone out. Or you've overridden my authority. You withdrew for him.
Oh,
okay.
Hello. Thank you to the speaker and Molweni Kuninonge, and greetings to the advocate, to everyone, the professors and the doctors that are attending, and the emerging lawyers that are here in the house.
Thank you, sir.
So, so my question, seeks to understand, but not to criticize, because I belong, I belong in the executive branch, So, yes, I do know about the judiciary, but, it's very brief. It's not, in-depth knowledge that I have.
Let's go to the question.
So, thank you, sir. So then, I once visited, the court, and I noticed that, we operate, as the executive differently from, the judiciary, because, things are not the same, in how we do things there. And, I know nothing, but I just have to acknowledge that. So, yeah. And then I wanted to ask, why is it that, in the courts, when we come there to attend, or when we come there, for our own different, issues, we have to stand outside, Why do we have to stand out? There's no waiting room, whereby, just like, for example,
okay.
No, I'm not criticizing anything, just like in the Department of Home Affairs,
Yeah.
in my executive branch, you have,
I think,
you wait.
I'm going to ask you to speak to the issue.
Yeah, I think that's the issue that I'm speaking into. So in the Department of, I just want to ask, things that are minor things, that we have.
We don't have a problem with that as long as you stick to the topic.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So then, in the Department of Home Affairs, for example, in my executive branch, you get to sit down.
I think
I would like to understand why. Yeah, the question is why and what are you doing as lawyers, to help improve that? Because there are old people that want to attend.
Thank you.
But they stand outside,
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. At this stage, I'd like to invite Prof to respond, and then after that, Ulwandile will lead us into the reflections. Thank you.
Thank you. Unlike Dr. Mtimga, I perfectly understand your question, because I actually had to stand not for 3 hours, but for 3 days in a queue at Home Affairs. And I still didn't get my ID. I had to ask them to send it by post. So I'm totally with you. And by the way, I understand that you can now apply for your ID at a bank if you go to ABSA. Do you have an account? Yeah, now go to your bank, they'll make your ID there. All right, let's get to the subject of the day. I admit the fact that the group of people that I am talking about ngamazemtiti, if you can use that term. But I don't regard the term as a pejorative one, because I think that's where the issue is the label of amazemtiti, the elites, whether it is necessarily a bad thing. And what is interesting for me is that mostly when we employ this term, it's employed by amanye amazemtiti to amanye amazemtiti. You know, so it's always the elites fighting against the elites, and the elites labeling the other elites as being less authentic than they are. But it's the same people. It's PhD holders, or it's master's holders. But it's the same people that are sitting at the auditorium of one of the best universities in the country, right? It's not the real people that are sitting outside of a kraal in a village, you know. And my experience with these people that are sitting outside of a village, a kraal, is that what they want are the same things that we want. You know, they don't want different things that we want. They want the same things that we want. But the difference with us is that we have the language and access. You have the university education. They may not have it, but they probably have the wisdom. And what they ask of us is to be their spokespersons, to articulate their demands and their needs. But ultimately, all of us is ngamazemtiti, you know, even those who pejoratively refer to us as amazemtiti. But ultimately, all of us are the same. The argument I did get is an argument, and I was debating this at Stellenbosch University. The argument that came was an argument about class. It's whether the argument I present is an argument that overlooks class and focuses much on race and nationalism and overlooks class. But I resist that. There are 4 areas that I'm interested in relation to their development in the law, areas that reflect the common law. It's property, which is at the forefront of what I try to do. It's delict, it's contract, and it's criminal law. That's what the common law is in this country. Those are the 4 areas of the common law. If you look at the first one, property, through the lens of class, the difference we have with the common law and the people that are the spokespersons of the common law is not a historical, it's a modern difference. It is whether or not the concept of property can operate in full to the complete exclusion of the rights of the others. So, which is what the common law system of South Africa does. Once you have title over a piece of ground, or title over any asset, the effect of that title is that it overrides even the interests of the state, right? Now, when you examine the origins of the British law of property, or for that matter, French law of property, or for that matter, Dutch law of property, individual title has never overridden interests of the state. It's always been subservient to state interests. But what happened in South Africa was a unique experience in which the colonists, whether they came through the Dutch East India Company or whether they came through the settlers of 1820, when they arrived, they established a new law of property, which was even in conflict with the European law of property, because it expanded the rights of property owners to the extent that they could override the interests of the state. Now, that level of absolutism of property was contested by SEME, right? Contested by SEME in legal arguments in court as contradicting African understandings of property. He was doing this in 1926. He lost the case, admittedly, he lost the case, right? But there is no reason for us, in rethinking about the law of property, we should not be making references to his own articulation of the understanding of property from an African perspective, right? There is also no reason why we should not, when we start property, I mean, I find in other universities, I haven't looked at your curriculum here, that constitutional law and law of property are taught separately. And you do not have something called constitutional property. In other words, what is the vision of property under the Constitution? Which is what every student should be learning. Not what is the definition of a thing in common law, which is what I was taught when I was a student. What you should be learning is what is the understanding of property under the Constitution. And there you will find that property is not an absolute thing. It is not to be held to the exclusion of others. It is often supposed to yield to the interests of the state. This is a practical problem. It's not a theoretical or a philosophical problem. It is also a practical problem. And we see it manifesting the most in debates about land. Should you have access to the landowner's property in order to visit the graves of your forefathers who used to work for the landowner? Absolutism in property will say no. But the new vision of property that is founded on the Constitution will say, of course you must, because property must yield to other interests, including cultural concerns, right? Should you have access to fetch water in a farm that is exclusively owned by a farmer when you're living in a neighborhood village which has no water stream? Absolute property will say no, because the farmer's rights is protected by title, and title is absolute. But the new vision of property will say, of course you should, because access to land should be separated from access to water, and one cannot have access to land in circumstances where people have no water and the only water stream is in the land that is protected by title. I'll give you a third example of the interface between criminal law and property. Again, this is not a philosophical problem. It is a practical problem. Should you criminalize walking over a piece of ground, right? Absolute property will say yes, because you have the crime of trespass, right? Crime of trespass, which also applies in relation to public property. Simply walking over a piece of ground when you have no permission is trespass, right? When was trespass formalized into the law in this country? It was only in 1953. Why? It was to give effect, right, to give effect to apartheid, to protect property owners, right? Now, I did a case most of you might or might not be aware about, where I asked for the striking down of the Rioters Assemblies Act, because I acted for the EFF and its leader had called on their supporters to occupy every vacant piece of ground wherever they find it, which would qualify as incitement to commit the offense of trespass. When you look at the history of the Rioters Assemblies Act, it's a 1956 piece of legislation. Its purpose was to silence Nelson Mandela and silence Robert Sobukwe at the time at which they called for the banishment of the past system. And they created a crime called to be a riotous assemblist, where you are inciting the commission of certain political crimes. Now, when the new South Africa came, we took this for granted. We assumed that this was the law, because it had been the law for so much. What we forgot was that the new constitutional system was intended to overturn these faulty European premises, right? Now we can call them European, but when you examine them, you find that even in Europe, this is not how the law was practiced. So we can go to many other areas. We can go to criminal law. I've already made the example of how crime protects property. And there is no reason why criminal law should be used to protect property in circumstances like trespassing. No reason for that at all. Or we can go to other examples about contracts, and we examine how the law of contract was intended to protect landowners, intended to protect capitalists. And that is why they gave effect to these self-adhesive contracts. Many insurance contracts are self-adhesive contracts. It's a totally one-sided contract. You're just given the sign. And the fiction in contract is to assume that everyone who signs an insurance contract, who never read it, or even when you get admitted here to the university, they give you a form and then you sign, but then you later on you learn, oh, this is a contract. So the idea that there should actually be an equal bargaining position so that the consent, which is an essential element in a contractual setup, can be established, is not part of the legal system. But there is no reason why it should not be part of the legal system. Or, for that matter, the law of delict. And if you look at its origins of the law of delict, lying in slavery, how much are you going to compensate an owner of a slave where a slave has lost an arm? Because the impact of a slave as a property is that once they lose an arm, they are unable to work. And then the person responsible for the injury does not pay the slave, but pays the master. And hence, the influences on the law of delict. You know, your car gets damaged, but because it is a thing, but you get the payment, not the car getting the payment, right? Now, the point I'm making is to examine the origins of this and then to find that they all lie in some sort of, in some form of oppressive European mindsets. And there is no reason to continue with them, and that we've got the constitutional framework we should be using as a basis for thinking afresh about delict, about crime, about property, about contract. And there, Professor Mkhize, it really does not matter whether you call the person making the argument Izemtiti, or whether you say that they are making a sort of a fresh revolutionary argument. What matters is the content of what they say. I like your question, sir, about the how to get indigenous languages into the courtroom. There is no reason why. I mean, the most important languages right now in law, not most important in sociology or in politics or in history or in economics, it's English and Afrikaans. If you understand English and understand Afrikaans, you'll just do well in the court system. But if you only speak Xhosa, tough luck for you. And it's a bit of a joke in Transkei, where everyone speaks Xhosa, prosecutor, judge, magistrate, everyone speaks Xhosa, and then you go there, and then there's all of this pretense of speaking English and then translating it, and then back again translating it. Utin, then, and then Utim Tegas, yeah, so that's a bit of a joke. Now, I argued this point with the former Minister of Justice, Bridget Mabant. I asked her specifically about this idea of, because the Constitution recognizes 11 languages, right? But the languages of record, because that's the issue, it's the languages of record have not changed. There are still only 2 languages of record. So the question is, how do you make the other languages of record as well, so that the transcript can be maintained in Xhosa? Because that's the problem, which is why you need a translation, is because of this requirement that the languages of record is English and Afrikaans. When they said to me that the problem was money, they just did not have enough money to make these other languages of record. I think the argument doesn't make a lot of sense. We should be changing it, because one of the difficulties with language is that in many respects, language does determine the outcomes. And I understand there are problems of interpretation where certain words have been said in a particular way and they could not be. But there is a larger problem that people feel that they are in a foreign institution when they are in a courtroom and they are supposed to speak in English, but all of their lives they've been speaking in Xhosa. They truly feel that they are still in a European court, even if the people wearing the robes look like them. But the moment the default language is a foreign language, they truly feel that they are. So which means that although they are formally within the institution of a courtroom, they still don't feel that they belong. Whereas the courts were intended to, a court is a very intimidating thing. Even for a lawyer, it's a very intimidating thing, you know. You have to go there many, many, many times that it feels home, you know. But the first time you go there, you feel terrified, you know. Imagine what your client feels like if you as a lawyer, you just don't know what to say. So these were all meant to be changed so that the institutions that dispense justice are reflective of our own experiences. But what again we have done is to perpetuate the systems of apartheid. The current excuse is there is no money, but it's the typical governmental excuse. Now, I agree with the point about traditional leaders, what their rights are. This is a long discussion we should have elsewhere, maybe about traditional leaders. I made the argument, I was speaking at the land conference, 20 past. So what should we do? All right, so Ndiagengo. All right, yeah, it's going to be a long answer, this thing of not. Let me just stop so that nabanye abantu abafuna uthetha bathethe. Okay, thank you.
Mine is, out of the interest of time, I'll just call in the guys for reflections. But I like how you then put a clarion call to law faculties to rethink how they do the teaching of the law in relation to the erasure of black thought in the development of the law. I think that's my take for me as I call the reflectors. I will call Ms. Oneza Potelwa, the chairperson of the Black Lawyers Association Student Chapter, to the stage, Mrs. Zizi Popoy, History Honors student, and Mr. Bongoletu Boy, History Honors student, to give 2-minute reflections, and then straight away I hand over to USC to then give closing remarks, then in tandem with adding the questions. Can we clap hands for them as they come to the stage?
Greetings to the House at large. Igama lami ndinguBongoletu Boy, and history honor student, like Umsamanga mentioned, under the supervision, I have to mention, of Prof Ngcukaitobi, no Dr. Khumalo. The session today was a very interesting and informative one, especially for Umdofana Namuke, that is an emerging historian and very passionate about the historiography of Africans. I won't quote exactly, Advocate, what you were... Actually, I wanted to pose this as a question for Q&A, but then I challenged myself, Ndobana, let me rather make it a reflection, because I think it would be better if I would rather challenge myself into answering it ngokwam. So you talked about, I won't quote you because I'm avoiding to misquote you, Advocate, but you said somewhere in your speech that we have tools to rediscover the foundations that were silenced and suppressed then. So now, like I said, that I'm very passionate about African historiography and all of that. It posed a lot of questions when you said we have tools to discover all of that, because I was there asking myself, what tools? Because at some point in your speech, you also mentioned that if we'd go to Stellenbosch looking for the archives, we wouldn't find them. So basically, the tools that you're talking about, it posed a lot of a question mark, because as those tools, I was a corner, but where do I find them? Where do I begin? And what tools are there? And Because, for example, Tina, like black people, the archives maybe, yeah, there's issues about archives specifically, because you spoke about the archives that we wouldn't be able to find at Stellenbosch. Now, not only about those type of archives, which are recordings, historical recordings, I was also thinking about, the issue of archives is very broad for us black people, Xhosa specifically, because there's oral archives, there's ritual archives, because we do know that we are people that are very much traditional. We practice these things. So basically, what tools do I have as an emerging historian in terms of finding out all of these and like these foundations? To what extent am I going to be able to actually do all of this? And Kaloko, as you know, the final rituals and dreams, visions, are they going to be able to be recognized as reliable sources in terms of archives and all of that? That is my reflection and from today's seminar. Thank you. Thanks, Advocate.
Molweni, igama lam ndinguzizipho boy, ngwaseNgcobo, by the way. I'm a history honors student.
Mamkwat.
No, Advocate, ndingumamqoqa uzikhali. You know, what's amazing about engaging with scholars is the fact that sometimes you'd find that your reflection has been addressed somewhere, somehow, and to a greater extent whereby all you have to do is to acknowledge. So, firstly, I'd like to start to say, go Prof Mkize. For them, Gamazemtiti, but for us and my generation, we call them the honorables or the respectables. So, my reflection on today's talk or lecture is that Professor Mkize raised a very valid point in terms of how do we relate to these people whom we consider as to have actually paved a way like Amazemtiti. So for me, I take that what Advocate stated that, but okay, they came with this, they built or they came up with the issue of coming up with the constitution as a counteract of Ilandoka, what you call, can someone please remind me the law? Sorry, I don't have a background law. Common law, sorry, thank you so much. As a common law. So my take as an emerging scholar is that it had to be them who actually go out there and acquire the knowledge that they got to acquire at that time. Because from my understanding, how do you dispute something you don't understand? So them going out, because if ever you look at the people that are discussed in this book, your Pixlika Isaka Seme, your George Mutso, and then the others, they are scholars, and they had to go out there to England and study all these law courses and study law like to a greater extent for them to understand what they are up against. And if it wasn't for their knowledge that they acquired, I guess it would be difficult for them to actually defend and come up with a constitution which they, at that time they thought was best for them and also for black people at large. So I say to you, Prof Mkize, is that maybe we really do need Amazemtiti in order for us to find where we really stand at this modern day and age. And also to produce scholars who are able, like Advocate has stated, but to regurgitate, which is ukwekisa. So for us, it's not to take whatever that we're given by them and also by the colonial regime, but for us to actually reflect on both and say, okay, as emerging scholars, this is the change we're bringing. So you see, we're taking knowledge like from two different aspects now, but not just one, of which it's really broad and it's also challenging, but then also a good thing. Also, Advocate, I wouldn't be doing justice as a historian or an emerging history scholar by saying that your book speaks to us as historians, not just in an extent of addressing law or the history of law, but it speaks to us as historians. Because you know, one thing I learned in history is that Africa at some point was perceived to not have history, like we were considered to be people, especially black people, to not have history. But now when you get to learn that they're actually black scholars who form part of history, and now they are being written about, because I'm sure some people didn't know Pixlika Isakaseme at some point, but now because of this book, we now know that there was such a person, and we also have our own intellectuals in the legal fraternity, which we can pride ourselves with. So it's very good, and it puts me at a point whereby I'm very proud to be black, that at some point we had people who were brave enough, black people brave enough to say, you know what, we're gonna be facing this colonial regime, we're gonna be facing the apartheid government as black people in order for our former generations to have it easy. They more have paved the way for us, if I may put it like that. Before I hand over to another reflection speaker, I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that we do really, as Bongo has stated, have an issue with archives, and specifically when it comes to the black history. And my take on that, Advocate in one of his interviews, like, I'm not sure about the year, but it was with Uli N. Manners, where you mentioned that it was also hard for you to actually acquire sources with regards to these people, because, for example, now you are reflecting on people who are no longer with us, so you had to go and consult on their archival work, of which was very difficult. So you said, and I'm not quoting directly on what you said, but then it was around the lines of, for you had to understand the Eurocentric discussions, or the Eurocentric writings about these people, in order for you to say, this is where I draw the line. I don't feel it could have happened like this. And one thing I learned from one of my mentors is that as a historian, you have to build a mind of, firstly, when you look into a certain source, before you say this source is credible, you have to look at their background first. After you've discovered where they come from and their background, then you go to okay, forgot the term. I'm very forgetful and I'm very under pressure, forgive me. I'm nervous, but we're getting there. So after you discovered their background, you have to go to schools of history, of historiography, and then see where they fit under before you can actually consider them as credible. So what I feel you did, or what you said on that interview, is that it took for you to understand their background, of which we state them as Amazem Diti, and then you go back to how they perceived history according to the schools they fall under, and then that's where you made like a conclusion to say, this is how I feel their history should be known. Their history is valid enough to pave the way for future scholars. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Igama lam ndingu-Oneza Pothelwa. I'm from the Black Lawyers Association student chapter, and I'm an emerging lawyer. So part of the reason why I wanted to study law was because of how they spoke, how they dressed, and I wanted to be that. But now what stood out for me in this address is that the faculties are indeed producing photocopies of westernized thinking. We want to speak that English. There's no one who's studying law who doesn't want to speak that English. And to address this problem, I believe the solution is reading. Students must read to decolonize their thinking. Western ways of thinking are very colonial, and we must decolonize a way of thinking through engagement with literature, particularly the works of African scholars. So we can start doing this even outside of the classroom. We do not have to limit ourselves to what we are being taught in the classroom. The Black Lawyers Association student chapter is piloting a reading program that will answer the questions of decolonization, so that members do not think like settlers. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Okay, so ndingasase ndigqibezana la mibuzo beqalwe ngayo. Ndibonile ke into yobana ndingahlala mosa. Endimana ndiphakama nje all along. Qaphe lapha kwi-students bayahlala phantsi. Exactly. So I just wanted to first not respond, because you know this idea of responding, it puts you on a pedestal of some sort. Yeah, I mean, around that issue of this idea of the Constitution as an attempt to correct the imperfections of the common law system. The one thing I wanted to add, I mean, I already spoken about the substance of it, which is in the 4 areas of property, crime, contract, and delict as the main drivers of the common law. Is that the way we design our curriculum is we say the foundations are in the common law, and that is what we do. We repeat this, and the students go out thinking that the foundations are in the common law, but they forget that actually the idea was not that the foundations must be in the common law, that the foundations must be thought anew, afresh. And that is what explains the continued dominance of the common law in the ways in which we think. And even that is why we have a problem with contracts and property. When you read the judgments from the Supreme Court of Appeal, etc., most of them decide the law as if the Constitution was not even passed. And so the Constitution as a doctrine of foundation, the moment in which we broke from the past, is constantly playing catch up. And it's playing catch up in a system that has had 350 years of establishment, building, germinating, influencing, etc. And there's a second problem with it, which is the problem of customary law. Is that although the customary law precedes, in terms of years, age, common law, the way it's dealt with in the Constitution, it's an adjunct. I mean, the Constitution says both customary law and common law exist, but they must be applied to the extent that they are consistent with the Constitution. But what everybody forgets is that there is no language of customary law. And in many respects, customary law is suffering from distortions of the past. One of the points I was going to make about chiefs, it's a chapter. Someone got very upset from Ingonyama Trust last week when I made the point that the fact that chiefs control the land is a colonial distortion. And land was always controlled by the people. If chiefs had any role, it was a role of trusteeship. But for the most part, chiefs had no role to play in the land. The land was, and even the idea of communal, every piece of ground is communal, is itself a colonial distortion. Because land was family, and then certain areas like grazing areas and water, etc., would then become colonial. But where you have your stand and your graves, that's family. It passes from family to family. The only difference was that it was never formalized in a written title. But everyone knew, no one can just come in and then stay there. But the way customary law is written is an utter distortion of what the lived reality of customary law is. So the one point I wanted to make is that the reason I insist on this idea that we're not resolving a 1652 problem, but a 2023 problem, is that even customary law needs to be rethought as living customary law. In other words, how do we live today? Not how we wished we lived in the absence of the colonists, when for 350 years we've actually had the colonists with us. So that's the reimagination I am pushing for us to have. Now, many of us may feel this exercise is too daunting and too huge, but we shouldn't feel that way. Arthur Chaskalson, last year I gave the inaugural lecture of Arthur Chaskalson lecture at the Equal Education. When I researched him, in his interviews, he gave about 3 interviews when he was first appointed as president of the Constitutional Court. What he said was that we will start from a clean slate. And he repeated this to the president of the Transvaal Provincial Division, and he repeated it to the Chief Justice of Australia. In correspondence, he wrote a letter, we will start from a clean slate. We will start. Now think about this. He said, we will start from a clean slate. Now, the idea of a clean slate, in many respects, contradicts the common law, because the common law is based on this concept of precedent. But Charles Cosson was making a radical statement when he said, we are not going to be bound by precedent. We will start from a clean slate. His court tried in its first 10 years to start from a clean slate, but today we go back to 1956, we go back to 1920. It just is mind-boggling. So I come back to, what does it mean to start from a clean slate when you are trying to build a constitutional system? Now, that is what the new scholars must be thinking about. That's why I agree with Dr. Tembeka, who says that we've got to be building critical thinkers of the system, not people that are just going to regurgitate and repeat, right? Whereas the legal way of teaching, especially the British system, the legal way of teaching the British system is you've got to teach people not to be critical, but to repeat what has been said because of this doctrine of precedent. Right? You've got to do what the people that were before you did. That's how the precedent system works. But the promise here was that we are going to start from a clean slate, right? So, which means we don't only start from the clean slate in court, we also start from a clean slate in the academy. Then, what else is there to be said by me? I just wanted to reflect around, this is a very big question that you raise around, where do we begin, where are the archives, etc. It's a big debate, because I think you are also right in understanding the archives are fresh, because in many respects, maybe it's too loose for me to argue that we have the tools, but I think what I probably should argue is that we have the possibility to create the tools, right? Because even the archive is something we need to build, because Black experiences, right, live through word of mouth, but we can record them now. This idea that people before us did not record them, but we can record those Black experiences right now. We can also look at different sources of intellectual thought. Of course, if you're looking at what did Black people think in 1890, you are not going to find that in a book, but you may find it in a newspaper, in a Black newspaper, because the newspaper was also the space at which this debate was taking place, right? So if you look at the Nongause incident, it's debated at length in newspapers by people that are writing in Xhosa. This is all happening in the 1880s and in the 1870s. And in the Black newspapers, there's a big debate. And that's less than 20 years after the event. It's actually very fresh. So you will find that newspaper is then used as a space for intellectual expression that you can find and think about. But you've got to create it as well. You've got to do the interviews. You've got to take the statements from people that were there. And you've got to build this archive and keep it. So we have to keep the imagination of what the new in the new South Africa actually stands for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, SC. I can safely say this was one of the most fruitful discussions. Rethinking, relearning, engaging, equipping ourselves, commitment to change, decolonial thinking, transformation is what I take out with me from this discussion. And I want to thank you, everyone present, students, academics present here, for making mine and Dr. Tembeka's job very easy as program directors, being cooperative and engaging. With those words being said, we've come to the end of the masterclass. Thank you so much. We would do with the last round of applause for SC. Thank you so much. We're done. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.